Hi there, welcome to the Forth Valley and West Lothian supported study resource for National 5 History. This has been produced to support your study throughout Easter School. Our learning intention for today is that we are learning how to achieve the highest possible marks in each of the question types that will be examined in the National 5 History exam. Our success criteria for today is that I can structure my answers effectively and I can understand how to achieve full marks in each of the question types in the National 5 History paper. So the intention for today is that not only will you be able to understand how to put your answers together, but where your marks are going to be coming from. And that's going to give you the best chance of success in your final exam in May. Throughout today's lesson, you'll see various symbols on the slides that will indicate what you should do at particular times. The symbols that you will see throughout the lesson are currently on the screen in front of you. The first symbol is asking you to listen to the information that has been shared as part of the presentation. The second symbol is asking you to speak or repeat whatever information has been shared. The third symbol is asking you to read the information that is on the slide. This is going to be particularly important when looking at the structure of answers or when reading through different sources. It's often going to be used in conjunction with the listen symbol. The fourth symbol is that you're being asked to write or copy whatever information is on the slide. The fifth symbol is asking you to correct your work, and that's going to be particularly helpful if you're able to answer any of the source or knowledge questions which are included as part of today's presentation. The final symbol is asking you to pause the video to allow you to complete the task that you're being asked to carry out. Before we begin today's Easter School revision session, it would be useful for you to have all of the resources to hand that you might need. What you will need today is a pen or a pencil. You will also need paper, and you may need a timer if you are completing any of the questions that are on the screen. You may want to have to hand a highlighter, and that will allow you to highlight key or important information that you would like to revise afterwards. You may also want to have post-it notes, which would be useful for you to write down any questions that might come to mind when looking through your revision information, and that would allow you to write it down and ask your teacher when you see them next. One of the most important things in your National 5 History exam is knowing what to expect on the day. We really do encourage you to take a look at the SQA past papers for National 5 History. A link that allows you to access these is included later in the presentation. The information that you see on the screen right now is the key details about your exam. Your exam will take place on Friday, the 20th of May. It will begin at 1 p.m. and it will last for 2 hours and 20 minutes. The number of marks available in the paper will be 80, and this will be made up of a range of different knowledge and skills questions. Before we get started looking at the different question types that you will be assessed on in your final exam, it's important to remind ourselves of the structure of the paper itself. In your exam, you will be answering questions from 3 different sections or contexts. There will be questions from a Scottish section, a British section, and a European and World section. You will have to flick through the booklet to find the relevant contexts or sections that you have studied, and remember that you should only answer questions on the topics or contexts that you yourself have studied with your teacher and your class. As we have already mentioned in today's presentation, it's really important for you to understand the structure of your paper. For this year, the SQA has made a change to the structure of the British and European and world contexts. In the Scottish section of your paper, you must answer all of the questions given in that context. So if, for example, you have studied the Migration and Empire section or context, you must answer all of the questions from Migration and Empire. If you have studied the First World War, you must answer all of the questions on the First World War. However, in the British and European and world sections, this will be a slightly different structure. Your final question for both Britain and European and world will include an optional question. This means that you can choose which of the final questions you should answer. So for example, you would choose to answer either 4A or 4B. It will be really important in the British and European world sections to read your questions very carefully to decide which question would suit you best and would give you the best chance of success in the final exam. Now, before we go on and have a look at how each question type should be answered, some helpful hints to support you in your revision. One of the most important things for you to do is check your timings for your questions. Every question should be answered within a certain amount of time. And by making sure that you have the timings correct for each of the questions, it will allow you to answer as much of the paper as you possibly can. Remember that when you're answering questions from the Scottish section, you should aim to include as many relevant Scottish examples where possible. One of the best ways for you to do this and to get experience of this is by completing as many timed past paper questions as you can. This is very good practice and it will make sure that you are feeling ready and that you're feeling confident for your final exam. All of the SQA exam questions from 2016 onwards can be accessed on the SQA website. These can be accessed through the following link that you see on the screen. In each of the sections that you will complete, you will be dealing with a number of different question types. You will have to deal with knowledge questions and source questions, both of which will require you to have a really good level of historical knowledge about each of the sections that you have studied. As part of your final exam, you will have to be able to answer 3 different types of knowledge questions, and you can see them currently on the screen in front of you. The first that you will have to be able to deal with is a describe question. This will always be worth 4 marks, and it should take approximately 6 to 7 minutes for you to complete. The second type of knowledge question is an explain question. This will always be worth 6 marks, and it should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete. The final question you may know as the 9-mark question or the 9-mark mini essay. You can always tell this question type by its stem, and it will begin with to what extent, how important, or how successfully, and you will always be able to see the mark allocation, which is 9 marks. This is a much more extended response, and it should take you around 15 to 16 minutes to complete this. As part of your final exam, you also have to be able to deal with 3 different types of source questions. The first is an evaluate the usefulness question. and it will begin with the stem that you currently see on the screen. Evaluate the usefulness of source A as evidence of, and then you will be given a historical event or historical development. This will always be worth 5 marks, and when completing this, it should take you approximately 8 to 9 minutes. The second type of source question will be a how fully question, and this will have the stem, how fully does source A describe, or how fully does source A explain, and then it will also be the historical event or development. A how fully question will always be worth 6 marks, and this should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete. The final type of source question is a compare the views question. In this question, you're going to be asked to look at 2 sources and decide what the similarities or differences may be. The question will always begin with compare the views of sources A and B about, and it will also be a historical development or event. This question will always be worth 4 marks, and it should take you approximately 6 to 7 minutes to complete. One of the first questions that we're going to be looking at today is a describe question, and how we go about answering a describe question. This is going to be one of the most straightforward structures in your paper. In its simplest form, a describe question is asking you to use your knowledge to give a description of a historical event. You can answer this question by providing 4 simple factual points, 2 developed points, or any combination of the 2. The key point to remember here is that your knowledge points should add up to 4. There is a suggested structure on the screen in front of you. You may have been taught a particular structure by your teacher with the rest of your class, but one of the best ways for you to pick up your marks is by keeping it simple for your marker to see exactly where you are giving your points of knowledge. You may want to structure your answer like this. Firstly, then you give your first point of knowledge. Then you give a full stop. Secondly, your second point of knowledge, full stop. Thirdly, your third point of knowledge, full stop. And then finally, your final point of knowledge and a full stop. We're now going to look at an example of a describe question from one of the SQA papers. This particular question has been taken from the 2019 past paper. It's from the Scottish section, and this is a question from the era of the Great War. The question itself is asking you to describe the militant tactics used by the suffragettes, and this question is worth 4 marks. At this point, if this is a section you have studied, you may want to pause the presentation and complete the question under timed conditions. Alternatively, you may want to access the SQA past papers and identify a describe question from one of the sections you have studied in the Scottish contexts and answer that question under timed conditions. So on the screen in front of you, you can now see an example of a describe answer. We will now read through it together. Suffragettes imprisoned in Duke Street Prison in Glasgow went on hunger strike. Suffragettes cut telephone and telegraph wires in Kilmarnock. Suffragettes also targeted buildings in bomb attacks. This is a very useful answer to see to demonstrate relevant Scottish examples for this particular context. Now that you've read through the answer, it's important for us to be able to identify where the marks are coming from. The answer is on the screen in front of you again, but it has now been colour-coded. And please take time to read through this a couple of times to make sure that you understand exactly where the marks are coming from. The first sentence, highlighted in red, is that the suffragettes imprisoned in Duke Street Prison in Glasgow went on hunger strike. This sentence was given 1 mark for relevant knowledge. The second sentence, highlighted in green, the suffragettes cut telephone and telegraph wires in Kilmarnock, was also given 1 mark for a relevant point of knowledge. The final sentence, highlighted in blue, suffragettes also targeted buildings in bomb attacks, was given 1 mark for knowledge. So in total, this answer would receive 3 out of 4. At this point, you may want to pause the presentation so that you can read through the answer again on your own to consolidate your understanding of the marking. We're now going to begin looking at the structure for answering an explain question. This question is worth 6 marks, and therefore it's going to be more extended than the answer that you would give for a describe question. The question itself is asking you to provide clear reasons why historical events happened or the impact that they had. The key thing to remember with an explain question is that you must provide very clear links between your knowledge point and the question. What this means is that in every single sentence of your explain answer, you have to give some sort of link to the question. A suggested structure can be seen on the screen in front of you. As we've already mentioned, when answering an explain question, you should make sure that each sentence begins with the word of the question. So if you start with the words of the question, you should follow this with the word because and then give your point of knowledge. You would then repeat this 6 times to ensure that you're giving yourself the best chance of scoring full marks for this particular question. So on the screen in front of you, you can now see an example of an explain question. This has been taken from the 2018 SQA paper. It's also from the Scottish section and it's on the Wars of Independence. The question itself is worth 6 marks and the wording of the question is as follows. Explain the reasons why the succession of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, caused problems for Scotland after 1286. At this point, you may wish to pause the presentation and complete this question. If this is not a section or a context that you yourself have studied, please go back to the SQA papers and identify a question that you would be able to answer based on what you have learned in class. Just a reminder, this question should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete. Remember to time yourself when you're completing any past paper questions. At this point, if this is a question that you have answered, you may want to pause the presentation and correct your work using the SQA marking instructions provided. If not, you may want to refer back to the SQA marking instructions for a question that you yourself have chosen, or alternatively, turn to the next slide, which will look at an exemplar answer that shows how you could have approached an answer to this type of question. On the screen in front of you, you can now see an example of an explain answer. At this point, you should pause the presentation and take time to read through the answer on your own. One reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem was because there was no other direct heir to the Scottish throne. Another reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem is because Margaret was a girl, which meant that she couldn't lead the troops in battle. Another reason why the succession was a problem was because she was only a child, so she couldn't lead the country. Another reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem was because she was foreign and had never lived in Scotland before. Now, as you can see on the screen, this particular answer received 4 marks. The part of the answer, which is highlighted in green, shows an example of how you can link your point back to the question. In this case, the candidate has lifted the words of the question and repeated that at the start of every sentence. So in the first example, one reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem was because. That part is the link to the question. The next part that follows is knowledge. There was no other direct heir to the Scottish throne. This receives 1 mark for providing a valid reason that is linked to the question. In the second sentence, another reason why the succession of Margaret was a problem is because. That part is linking to the question. The next part of the sentence is the knowledge. Margaret was a girl, which meant that she couldn't lead the troops in battle. This second sentence was awarded 1 mark for providing a valid reason that is linked to the question. The third sentence, another reason why the succession was a problem was because, is the link to the question, and then the knowledge, she was only a child, so she couldn't lead the country. That was also given 1 mark for providing a valid reason linked to the question. The candidate has repeated the same structure for the final sentence, and therefore they would have been awarded 4 marks for the answer that has already been presented. The final knowledge question that we will be looking at today is the 9-mark question. Now, the question stems for a 9-marker short essay, may include how important, to what extent, and how successfully. The structure for these 9 markers will be very, very similar, and we will look at the structure just shortly. The question may be an isolated factor question. This usually begins with how important or to what extent. An isolated factor question means that you will be asked to talk about the one factor that's in the question, but you'll also need to be able to talk about that one plus others. However, you may also have to deal with a judgment question, which will usually begin with how successfully. This question type means that you're being asked to look at both sides of an argument before making a decision. In your final exam, you will have to deal with 2 different 9-mark questions across the paper. This is a massive 18 marks, and therefore it's really important for you to understand how you answer this particular question and where the marks themselves are coming from. In a 9-mark question, your marks are allocated as follows. For your introduction, there is 1 mark available. This can be achieved in one of 2 ways. Either you give 1 developed point of background knowledge, or you provide a list of factors that you're going to discuss in your answer. If you're providing the list of factors, it's important to remember that in order for the mark to be given, you have to give at least 2 factors in your introduction. There are 5 marks available for knowledge. These should be clear, factual points that are relevant to the question. You can receive a maximum of 3 knowledge marks if you are only talking about 1 factor. Therefore, it's very important that when you're studying, you're looking at a range of different factors and different topics to allow you to access as many marks as possible. There is 1 mark available for balance. This is given for linking at least 2 of your factors to the question. The easiest way of picking up this mark is by starting each knowledge point with the words of the question, just like you would do in an explain answer. It's the same sort of skill. There are 2 marks available for your conclusion. In order to gain the full 2 marks, you have to make a clear judgment on the question. In an isolated factor question, this means identifying the most important factor. In a judgment question, this means answering the question directly. In order for you to gain the second conclusion mark, you have to give supporting evidence to back up your judgment. So to summarise, the top tips for a 9-mark question are to ensure that your 9-marker follows a clear structure. Your answer should have an introduction, main factors, and aim for at least 2 main factors, and a conclusion which answers the question. You should also start each sentence of your factors or knowledge with the words of the question. We're now going to look at an example of a 9-mark question. This particular question has been taken from the 2019 European and World section of the paper, and it's on Hitler and Nazi Germany. The question itself: to what extent was the appeal of Nazi promises the main reason for their rise to power by 1933? And this question is worth 9 marks. At this point, you may want to pause the presentation and complete this question under timed conditions. Alternatively, you may want to complete your own 9-mark question from a different context or section. As a reminder, this question should take you approximately 15 to 16 minutes to complete. And please remember to time yourself when completing any past paper questions. If you have completed this particular question, you may want to pause the presentation again to correct your work. You can do this by using the summary marking instructions on the screen or by accessing the full marking instructions on the link provided. Alternatively, please turn to the next slide where we will look at an exemplar answer. On the screen in front of you, you can now see an example of a 9-mark question answer, with the focus on this being the introduction. This is a really nice example to show you of how a candidate can pick up their marks, and they have provided both a relevant point of background information and a list of factors. Remember, in this answer, it's either or to get 1 out of 1 for your introduction. But in this case, the candidate has done both. The introduction itself. In January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor as he was leader of the largest party in the Reichstag. The Nazis were so popular for many reasons, including the appeal of Nazi promises, Hitler's speaking ability, and the need for a strong government. We're now going to look at an example of a factor. Remember that one of the easiest ways for you to pick up your balance mark is by starting your factor with the words of the question. In this case, it has been highlighted for you with the link to the question in bold and underlined. This candidate has done it both at the start of the factor and about halfway through. The answer itself. The appeal of the Nazis was key in their rise to power, as at this point, Germany was suffering from another economic depression after the Wall Street crash. The candidate then goes on to develop this when they say in 1933, around 6 million were unemployed, which Hitler promised to solve. This sentence is awarded 1 mark for knowledge, and the candidate has provided really specific historical knowledge to back up their initial point. They're then credited with a developed point for knowledge in the second half of their answer. The economic hardship was also not improving due to the war reparations that Germany had to pay after the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler promised to destroy the treaty. This is a relevant point of knowledge which answers the question. On the screen in front of you, you can now see an example of a conclusion. Remember that in your conclusion, if it's an isolated factor question, you have to identify what was the most important factor that led to the historical development you've been asked about. So in this case, it's been highlighted for you where the mark has been awarded for judgment. In conclusion, Hitler's speaking ability was the main reason why the Nazis were able to rise to power. That sentence is awarded 1 mark for judgment. The second sentence is awarded 1 mark for providing a supporting reason which backs up the judgment. This is because without it, no one would have listened to the Nazi promises in the first place. Thank you so much for your attention and focus so far in our session. At this point, you should call a checkpoint for your own knowledge. You should pause the presentation and look back over any notes that you have made on the knowledge questions that we have discussed. The describe question, the explain question, and the 9 marker. Do you understand the structure and mark allocation for each question? So we're now going to move on and have a look at our source questions, and we're going to begin today with an evaluate the usefulness question. Now what this question is asking you to do is to read through a historical source and comment on its usefulness in terms of the content of the source, so the information that's in the source omission, so what the source fails to tell us, the authorship of the source, which is who wrote the source, the timing of the source, which is when the source was written, the type of source that it is, and the purpose of the source. Now you may have been shown a particular structure for answering this question in school, and if that's a structure that you're comfortable with, then that's what you go ahead with. However, I am going to be showing you a structure that will allow you to maximise your marks for this particular type of question. We're now going to look at a suggested structure that would allow you to maximise your marks for this particular type of question. You start by commenting on the content of the source, and you would structure it just the way you see it on the screen just now. You select a relevant quote from the source that answers the question, and you structure it in the sentence, source A says, you give your quote, which is useful because it is accurate. It's very, very important in this particular part of your answer to tell me that the source is useful because it is accurate. And you do this twice. It's 2 separate quotes and 2 separate comments. And the comment that you keep using for the content of the source is telling me it's useful because it's accurate. The second thing that you look to do is to comment on source omission. So there's 2 marks available for the content of the source and 2 marks available for source omission. If you are able to structure your answer correctly and pick up both of the marks for content and both marks for source omission, then you've guaranteed yourself already 4 out of 5. How you structure your comment on source omission is to say the source is limited because it fails to mention, and again you do this twice. Now on the screen you can see suggested comments on authorship and timing. In your school you may also comment on the purpose and the type of the source, and if this is something that you're comfortable with, then that's absolutely fine. However, you may prefer to just comment on author and timing, which again is also fine. There's 1 comment available for authorship and 1 comment available for timing. How I would suggest that you structure your part on authorship is to say source A was written by, and you must name the author. It's not enough to give a vague general comment. If you are told the specific name of the author, you have to tell me that. If you're told something like source was written by a modern historian, then for that part of your answer you would say source A was written by a modern historian, and the part that follows that is your explanation of why that is or it isn't useful. You have very similar structure for timing. So source A was written in, and you must name the date. It's not enough to say it's a primary or a secondary source. If you're given the specific date that a source is written, you must tell me that. The explanation that follows is to say this makes the source useful or less useful, and we'll look in just a minute at the explanations that you could give for this particular part of your answer. Okay, so all that we're looking at here is some possible comments that you could give on certain aspects of the source to allow for full source evaluation. So we've already looked at how you deal with the content and source omission within a source, but things like authorship, timing, purpose and type of source will all be different depending on the source that you have been given. So you can see on the screen, generally, there's two types of author. There might be a variation in amongst that as well, and that's something that your teacher will talk through with you. But for the vast majority of sources, there's two types of author. There's someone who was there, or the author's a historian. And you can see the comments for both of them. If the author is someone who was there, and remember you would tell me who that person was, your comment for that is that it's useful because this person was an eyewitness who saw, and then whatever the historical event is, you would name it. If the person is a historian, it's a standard comment that you use. A historian is useful because this person is an expert who will have good historical knowledge about the event. For timing, again, there might be some differences or some variations in timing, and that's something your teacher would talk to you about again. But for the majority, you would either have a primary source, which is a source taken from the time of an event, or a secondary source, which is a source that's produced after the time of an event. Remember, as part of your answer, you would have to name what the date is, so please make sure that you're reading your sources very carefully. Your comment, if the source is primary, is to say it's useful because it's taken from the time of, and you have to name the event. It is not enough to say it's taken from the time of the event. You have to name what the event is. History has got lots of different periods of time, so it's very important for you to be as specific as you possibly can. If the source is a secondary source, again, we have quite a standard response that you would have there, which is to say the source is useful because it has been written with the value of hindsight. Now, hindsight means that the historian has gathered together lots of sources of information, they've looked at it overall, and they're then looking back on the event with the benefit of having that additional information. And again here, what we can see is two other aspects of the source, the type and purpose of the source, the area of the source that you could comment on, and some possible comments. Now again, I'm sure that a lot of your teachers will have already gone through this with you, but just for some of the common types of source and the common types of purpose for sources, just looking at some of the comments that you could make for that. So if the source is a textbook, a possible comment for that would be it's useful because it's likely to have been well researched. If it's an interview, it's useful because it's more likely to contain honest, accurate information. Purpose of a source, generally speaking, is one of two. The purpose of a source is usually either to influence or to inform. Now, a source that influences may be less useful because it may contain evidence of bias. However, you would need to read the source to see if that was the case. However, it may also be the case that a source designed to influence could be more useful because it provides an accurate representation of attitudes of the time. A source that's been written to inform is useful because it's likely to contain accurate and balanced information. So we're now going to look at an example of an evaluate the usefulness question and an exemplar answer. Source A has been taken from a textbook written by modern historians, published in 2013. The source itself is taken from the free at last topic in the European and world context. The source tells us slavery had been abolished in the 1860s, but the southern states of the USA used Jim Crow laws to maintain a segregated society. Black children were forbidden to attend school with white children. At work, Black Americans collected their pay separately from whites. There was also strict bans on blacks and whites marrying. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that such segregation of black people from white people was acceptable. Their ruling was called the separate but equal decision. The question itself: evaluate the usefulness of source A as evidence of the ways in which the Jim Crow laws segregated black and white Americans. At this point, if this is a question that you would have completed in your school if you study the free at last topic, you can pause the recording and you can complete the question that you see on the screen. If you don't complete the free at last topic in your school, you can access the SQA past papers online and you can find and evaluate the usefulness question in one of the sections that you do study, and you can also complete it under timed conditions. Just a reminder that this question should take 8 to 9 minutes for you to complete under timed conditions. So at this point, I would be asking you to use the information on the screen to correct your answer. If you did not complete the free at last evaluate the usefulness question, you can use the marking instructions available from the SQA website for the evaluate the usefulness question that you have selected. So we're now going to take a look at an evaluate the usefulness exemplar answer to see how marks would be allocated. From what you can see on the screen, source A says black children were forbidden to attend school with white children. This makes the source useful because it is accurate. Source A also says at work, black Americans collected their pay separately from whites. This makes the source more useful because I know it is accurate. For the 2 points that you see here, 2 marks would be given. Two correct quotes have been identified from the source, and the explanation, the source is useful because it's accurate, have also been given. The second part of the answer that you see on the screen is from the source omission. However, the source does not mention how blacks and whites had separate toilets, which makes the source less useful. The source also does not mention how blacks and whites had separate water fountains, which makes the source less useful. 2 marks were also picked up for this part of the answer. So overall, what you see on the screen, currently this answer would receive 4 out of 5. So for the rest of the answer, the source was published in 2013. It has the benefit of hindsight, which makes the source more useful. 1 mark has been given here for timing. We can see clearly that the date has been identified, 2013, and the explanation has been given. We can see in the answer that the source is more useful, and the explanation is because it was written with the benefit of hindsight. The second part of the answer, the source is from a textbook, which means it will be well researched and not biased, which makes it more useful. 1 mark here was also given for type. In the answer, we can see the type of source and an explanation on why this is useful. We're now going to look at the structure for answering a how fully question. Now, in your National 5 History exam, you are going to have to deal with 2 different types of how fully questions. The first is how fully does source A describe, and the second is how fully does source A explain the reasons why. Now, these are skills that you have already examined yourself on through the describe and explain knowledge questions, but we're now going to apply a similar skill to your how fully. In the explain type question, you must be very, very careful to make sure that the points you provide as recalled knowledge are linked to the question. What I would suggest is your easiest way to do that is in a how fully explain answer, when giving recalled knowledge, start your recall with the words of the question. Now, the structure for a how fully question is very specific. There are 6 marks available for this particular answer, and you will have to deal with 3 of those in your final exam. You can pick up 3 marks for interpreting relevant points or reasons from the source. And the key point here is that you have to interpret. It is not enough to simply quote. You must either quote and explain or paraphrase, and that will allow you to interpret the points that you need from the source, and you should do that 3 times. You pick up your final 3 marks by providing 3 pieces of relevant recalled knowledge. And remember, in a how fully explain question, your recall must be linked to the question. So just as a reminder then of how you answer a how fully question, have a look at the information that's currently on the screen. The first thing that you have to do is make a judgment on the source, and you can approach it as follows. Source A partly or to an extent either describes or explains, and then you use the words of the question. Please remember to include your judgment in your answer. Without an opening judgment or without a judgment in your answer, the maximum marks you could receive is 2 out of 6. From there, you have to identify what the source tells us, and you do that 3 times. Now, your teacher may have asked you to approach this by paraphrasing or by quoting and explaining. You should follow whichever structure advised by your teacher, because that's the one that you will be in the most practice of doing. Both will be accepted by the SQA, but remember it's 3 points from the source that you're either quoting and explaining or paraphrasing. From there, you should identify what the source has missed out. And the way that you could approach that or introduce it is by saying, however, source A is limited as it fails to mention, and give your point of recalled knowledge. You need to do this 3 times to allow you to access the full 6 out of 6 for this answer. So we're now going to look at an example of a how fully question. This has been taken from the SQA 2019 paper, and it's on free at last. The question itself is a how fully describe question. So the wording of the question, how fully does source B describe the non-violent protests of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s? You're being asked to use the source and recall to reach a judgment, and the source question itself is worth 6 marks. At this point, you may want to pause the presentation to allow you to complete this question. Alternatively, you may want to pause the presentation to complete your own example of a how fully question. As a reminder, this question should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete, and remember to time yourself when you're completing any of the past paper questions. If you have now completed your how fully question, you may want to correct your work. You can pause the presentation and correct it using the full marking instruction which has been provided on the screen in front of you. Alternatively, please turn to the next slide where we will look at an exemplar answer of how this question could have been approached. We're now going to look at an example of an exemplar answer to this particular question. In this case, the candidate has chosen to paraphrase their source points. If you're in the practice of quoting and explaining, this is also perfectly acceptable, and it's something that you should continue to do if your teacher has taught you in this way. If you have also decided to paraphrase, that's fine. The SQA will accept either paraphrasing or quote and explain in a how fully question. In the first sentence, the candidate has made a nice, clear judgment on the source, where they've said, Source A partly describes the non-violent protests of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. The part in bold shows where the candidate has made the judgment. Although they don't receive a mark for this, it means that the rest of the marks for this answer become available. Remember that without a valid judgment, the maximum you can get is 2 out of 6. The first source point receives 1 mark for a source point being paraphrased. The source tells us that legal action took place in the Supreme Court to win the right to send his child to a white school. The second source point also receives 1 mark for being paraphrased. The source tells us that 9 black children did not retaliate to the abuse of white protesters in Little Rock. At this point, the candidate then starts to introduce recalled knowledge to us. They have made a further judgment on the source where it says the source fails to tell us. Just like in the opening sentence, this indicates to the marker that you understand that the source only tells part of the story and that you have relevant recall to introduce. In this answer, the first point of recall is about the Freedom Rides, where it says that they took place with Black Americans travelling throughout the South to see if, even after the Supreme Court decision, if the states were finally desegregated. This gets 1 point for relevant recall. The final recall point is also introduced with good practice. The source fails to tell us about the Birmingham demonstration where many black kids were arrested and Black Americans were targeted with power hoses, which shocked the nation. In this case, the candidate would have received 4 marks for the points provided. The final type of source question that we're going to be looking at today is a source comparison question. This type of question will usually start with the phrase, compare the views of sources A and B about. What you're being asked to do here is to look at the 2 sources and identify the similarities or differences between them. Remember, in a source comparison question, this will be worth 4 marks and it should take you about 6 to 7 minutes to complete. What's also very important for you to remember when answering this question is that you don't need any recalled knowledge in this answer. Absolutely everything that you need to answer this question is in the source. So please make sure that you're reading it really carefully when you're going through your paper. A helpful hint I would suggest to you is when you are completing a source comparison answer, you try to use 2 different coloured highlighters or pens or pencils when you're reading the sources. What you can do is use them to highlight the points from the source that match up with each other, and that will make it easier for you to see the comparisons when you're actually writing out your answer. So we're now going to look at the structure for answering a source comparison question. I would encourage you to try to use the following structure to give you the best chance of maximising your marks. Step 1 is worth 1 mark. And really all you're having to do here is to look at the 2 sources and decide if they agree or disagree, and then you use the words of the question. And you can see on the screen how you would structure that. Step 2 is also worth 1 mark, and at that point you're being asked to refer to the sources. You can quote in a source comparison question, And how you would approach it is by saying source A says, you give your first quote, and then source B agrees or disagrees when it says, and you give your second quote. From there, we would go on to step 3, which is also worth 1 mark. At that point, you're going to sum up the comparison from the quotes that you have just given. So this proves that sources A and B agree or disagree about, and you go back to the 2 quotes that you've just given and you sum up that area of comparison. It doesn't matter which order that you do steps 2 and 3 in. You might find that in your school, your teachers asked you to sum up the area of comparison before you give the quotes, and that's absolutely fine. You would still be given the mark for that. For the rest of your answer, because this is still worth 4 marks, then you repeat steps 2 and 3, and that would allow you to access the full marks for this question. It's worth bearing in mind again that there's no recall involved in this answer, and it's a really good opportunity for you to boost your marks across the paper. Just make sure that you've learned the structure for dealing with this particular question. You will now be absolutely delighted to hear that we have reached the end of our session on National 5 History for Easter School. Our focus for today has been looking at the ways, strategies and approaches that you can use to maximise your marks for the National 5 History exam in May. At this point, you should now be able to structure your answers effectively, and you should now understand how to achieve full marks for each of the question types in the National 5 History course. So in summary, you should know where the marks are coming from for each question and how to answer the questions themselves. So now just some suggested next steps to help you to continue to practice and prepare for your final exam. The most important thing that you should remember to use is the SQA past papers. These are available at the link that you see on the screen. Alternatively, you can just do a search for them on the internet and look for SQA past papers, and it's usually one of the first results that would come up. Using that link, you will find the question papers and marking instructions, which will allow you to review any questions that you have completed at home. Another suggestion will be to look back again at all of the question types that we have looked at today and begin to rank them in order, starting with the question type that you feel the least confident in and working your way up to those that you feel most confident in. In doing so, this will allow you to identify the question types that you need the most practice on, and that will help you to prepare for any questions that you will either need to complete in school or in your final exam. This is a really effective way of creating targeted revision around specific question types. At this point, I would just like to say thank you so much for your attention and for your focus today, and I really wish you all the best of luck for your final exam.